Today I'm going to talk about Spring Batch using Db2. And by show of hands, how many people in here are DBAs? A few. How many are programmers? A few. Okay, great. So a little bit about this background. I worked with a Db2 expert on a large government program, as many petabytes of data, and we were testing processing with batch, and we were finishing up a stored procedure with the call. And we had a little bit of time left in the project, and I recommended looking at Spring Batch and see what that can do for us. Now, again, I'm going to high level. What is batch processing? I think most of you in here know what batch processing is. Talk about the JSR 352 standard, the Spring Batch reference implementation. I'm going to go through the slides first, and then I'm going to give a demonstration on the laptop. I have everything on the laptop, so hopefully it all works. And then any questions at the end, let me know about. So again, what is batch processing? Batch processing is the execution of a series of jobs in a program without manual intervention. That's what batch processing is. Usually, people don't get involved with it manually unless there's an event, there's an error, it times out, server goes down, any number of problems that could occur. And a typical batch process reads a large number of records from a database, file a queue, processes the data in some fashion, and writes the data out in modified form. That's what a batch process is. I'm going to talk about the JSR 352 in a minute. So I worked with DBA, and he was pretty skeptical of Java batch processing in general because he worked on a couple applications where they were trying to do batch processing Java. And this was back in 2008. There were no standards for Java batch processing. Developers would have to write their own custom code. And a lot of times they wouldn't catch or notice everything. For example, retries. There wouldn't be no logic for retries or skips. So they'd have to go in and write that code to get it done. And he had some issues with that, and they finally were able to get it to work. And again, the same problem is you have somebody else developing another batch process in Java with no standards. The same problems they run into. And so in 2013, a JSR standard came out. The author of the standard is IBM, JSR 352. This is based on many decades of batch processing that IBM has run into over the years, all the problems that could have, and how to resolve these problems. So this was an attempt to standardize how they process batch in Java. And it was kind of successful. Spring Batch was also part of this standard. They did the reference implementation for the JSR 352. And in version 3, they had a full implementation of the standard. So it is fully standardized in Spring Batch. Again, we talked about Spring Batch was the reference implementation of that. So introduction to Spring Batch. It's a Java-based framework for batch processing. Is anyone here familiar with Spring in general? Maybe a few people. So Spring is a framework that a lot of Java developers use to develop their application. It does a lot of the heavy lifting underneath where the programmers concentrate on the business logic. It's based on what is called POJO-based development approach from Spring Framework. POJO is plain old Java objects. It automates batch iteration. It processes similar records as a set without user interaction. So it takes care of all that stuff that you would do on the mainframe would do in Java batch based on this standard by IBM. It is robust, and it does provide an enterprise scale solution, and it is out in the field and is used. When I was talking to my DBA friend who I was working with, he said he referenced it. He looked at a couple of people that he worked with some of his networking, and he talked to someone in Chicago who did implement the Spring Batch processing. And being a DBA, one of his concerns was the cursors, which I'm going to go over today. Is cursor processing. There's a lot to cover in Spring Batch. You can talk about the retries. I could talk about skips. But I'm not going to do that today. I'm just going to talk about what the DBA thought was most important, because we handle large volumes of data. And one of his concerns was the cursors, and how do we handle that? The API supports transaction management, chunk-based processing, which I'm going to go into a little bit today, declarative IO, stop, retry, restart, retry, and skip, and it does have a web-based interface. So that is provided by the Spring Batch. It covers a vast array of input and output files. You have any file, JDBC, NoSQL, JMS. You can implement executing shell commands. Again, start, stop, restart jobs, maintaining state between the executions, which is very important. If your job fails, you don't want to have to restart. You don't have to start the job from scratch. You want to maintain state and go back and process it. Ability to skip and retry records. That's important because you could have bad data. You don't want to get stuck trying to process a record which cannot be processed, so you want to be able to skip that record. And you also want the ability to set the retry limit. So if you have, I don't know, 3 or 4 records that are failing, if you have over more than that, then you fail the whole batch processing. It has message notification. You can send out emails. And it's scalable. The scalability is by using MQ or any kind of JMS, and usually on Linux servers is how you scale this thing out. Again, when you do this batch processing, depending on what you're trying to do. I don't say it has one solution for everything. It's what the problem you're trying to solve. If you have mainframe batch processing that's running well and you don't see an apparent need to migrate to Java, leave it on the mainframe. If you have applications that are not as critical, you may want to consider going to Spring Batch. And also you have the thing with training the millennials and coming on. They might not be interested in COBOL and JCL. You get them involved in more of the Java side. So if you do migrate from the mainframe, you have something set up and standards in place that they can use. So different business case scenarios. Batch processing periodically, parallel processing of a job. We can massively parallel process the batch processing using message-driven processing. Manual scheduled restart after failures, and sequential processing of steps, and so on. This is a look at the Spring Batch architecture. What makes this architecture so powerful is you have it split out into three different levels. The Spring handles the batch core and batch infrastructure. Your developers are going to spend most of their time in the application. This is already there for you, implementing those JSR 352 standards. You don't have to write that code. You just you have an interface, you call the interface, and you implement that interface in your application. So that's one of the things about Spring that makes it powerful is the separation of concerns. Developers work mostly in the application layer. Separation of concerns. Developers concentrate on the business logic. You let the framework take care of the infrastructure. And one of the things I've seen people do is fight the architecture. Don't fight the architecture. If Spring is handling it, you let Spring handle that. A lot of people think they know better or do something. No, let Spring framework handle it. They have a large user community that goes out and fixes any bugs. You can get the latest releases, and it will take care of that for you. Another thing is a common core services as interfaces. You want to write to an interface. You don't worry about the underlying infrastructure, how that code is written. You code to the interface. So it makes it much easier to upgrade your next Spring implementation. It provides default implementations out of the box. You don't have to rewrite a bunch of code. You look at that's what I did on our project. I took a default implementation and just extended it. It makes it much easier. It's easy to configure, customize, and extend. And again, you're using Maven, and I have it running in Maven and in Jenkins pipeline. Okay, this is coming right out of the standard itself. You may be familiar with this from mainframe world. IBM basically took the knowledge that they gained from the mainframe world and used the same architecture in the Spring Batch. You have your job repository. This keeps track of all your jobs that you've run. You have a job launcher, which which launches your job. You have a job that you execute, and you can have one-to-many steps. And what makes the architecture simple is each step has a one-to-one relationship. You have an item reader, item processor, and item writer. And you process it that way as you're running through your application. And one of the things I looked into, the DBA wanted to look into the chunk-oriented processing. That's what he was concerned about. And the demo will talk about that a little bit. So there's several ways to process a chunk. The chunk is equivalent to the old checkpoint restart. You can restart after a batch failed to give you a consistent last point of consistency. And you can facilitate skip and retry processing. Chunks are controlled on the item processor level. The item reader seems to be outside. Some of the caveats we learned was the item reader seems to be outside chunk processing. And if you dig in further, we had two separate threads, and your results may vary. Most of the work that we did was in the item processor, committing on the chunk interval setting. And that's probably where most of your development will be, in the item processor. You do have to establish transaction control for each chunk. And it includes turning off auto commit, so you have to turn auto commit off. Any questions so far? No? Okay. You can read from many data sources in the item reader. In this demo, I'm going to read from Db2. You have to be careful coding the cursor. And one of the things that we did when we were researching this was doing web searches for Java chunk processing. Those were misleading. They didn't work as advertised. So it's really important to get this right for efficient processing. So I'm going to show you the wrong way to do it. So here's the wrong way to do an item reader batch cursor. You notice that you open a cursor, start with starting value, fetch first n rows only in the memory, close the cursor, evoke the item processor, and commit. And then try to open the cursor again in advanced starting phase. Well, the problem is materialized results could process thousands of times. We were running millions of records, and we found this out. And this is one of the things when we're talking with the DBA, oh, it's not working. So we tried Spring Batch, it's not going on. It's not going to happen. And you looked on the mainframe, and looked at the logs, and then you could see that this is what was happening. And the problem was we had this fetch first 10, for example, it just had fetch first 10 rows. The chunk size is also 10. So this caused a problem for us. And we resolved it by using a starting key value with holdability. We restart ability after failure, and we use this JDBC property fetch size to control how much data you get per message. You have to be careful when you do this, because too big you may run out of memory. Too small you may increase your network latency. You must keep your cursor position opened, and the materialized results in the cursor is only processed once. So this is the correct way to do it. And getting back to the architecture, this is kind of how it works through the step. You have a step. Each step has an item reader, item processor, and then an item writer. Notice I have item writer down here. This is I set up by the size, chunk size. So I read the item, process the item, read the next item, process the next item, and then write the items out, and then exit. Fairly simple. There is a schema out there for DB2, which I do have on this laptop. I have IBM version 11. I have the demo from IBM that comes with the version 11. I have the schema out there. It took some time to find out where the schema was in the Spring Batch core. I did find it, and this will create the batch tables that we need to use to run the batch processing. And if you take a look at the schema, this is what it looks like. You have your execution context, your batch step execution, job execution, and so on. This is when we first started out with the Spring Batch. We tried. There's two ways usually in Spring to do things. One's using XML. You can use XML. You can write code. We tried the XML approach first, and it didn't quite work out because. And you notice this JCL is similar to what you get on JSL, similar to what you would see in JCL. So it's kind of the equivalent to what you would see in JCL. You'll notice that I have properties here. Properties here, input file, output file, and then the log processor, reader, writer, reader, processor, and writer. And then a cleanup afterwards. The problem with this, if you have very simple jobs, you can write using this. When it starts getting complex, you're going to have to write code. It just, it got too cumbersome to write it using these XML files. So that's one thing we had to do is we had to go back and rewrite the code using the Spring and using Java. And I'm going to go over the schema review later. This is the DB visualizer. I'll show again the schema and what that looks like. And then I'm going to go over the code review. So I'm going to go over the code review first, and then I'm going to show you the demo. So let me finish the PowerPoint up. So the data source, you'll notice in your Spring configuration you have a data source. You have a JDBC driver. I have this connected. I have messages here. If you have parameters you want to pass through JDBC, you just add it to this URL. That's one of the things we did. And password, username, password, set the schema, Spring Batch. We have that set up in the Spring configuration. The next thing we have is the Spring Batch configuration. This is where I have the chunk size and fetch size settings in the code. And then I have a couple things where I set the fetch size here, and I set the SQL. And notice I've run it before processing. It's processing 3 in the chunks, so there's 3 processing, then it's writing. And then I completed the job. And this is where most of your business logic is going to be in. I made this fairly simple. We have a custom item processor. I just take a president, give him a $5,000 bonus. Everyone else gets a 5% raise. Seems fair to me, right? And then you see here I got the SQL select from this employee table versus an IBM table. Process it, write it, and then we have a thing called steps. So this is where the processing occurs. I have a bean called Spring Batch using Db2. I start the job. I only have one step, so it starts as one step. Get step 1, pass what the database is, do the chunk size, reader, processor, writer, and it completes. Okay, and then notice I've run this several times. This is in the batch job execution in the Spring Batch. You have all your runs that have already completed, and I have different statuses as I was going through testing this. So you'll notice some of these have completed. Some I have no op, which means if it's already run, the step is already run, I don't want to process it again. And you should have one, actually I have one here that failed. So all this is kept in the Spring Batch. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through JSON. I'm going to JSONize this and then display it. So you're going to JSONize and then display the data on the screen. Any questions so far? Spring Batch processing applications. There's several that are out there. Anything you do on mainframe you can do in Spring Batch. Conversion, validation, extract, update, processing, updating, output, and formatting. Okay, let me go right into the demo real quick. I wanted to make sure I had enough time. And I'll get right into that. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to show is the reference table. So this is the the Spring Batch and the tables that it uses for the batch processing. Once you've loaded these schemas in here, the schema, this is where you take a look at some of the operations that I've run. I've done several that have completed. Some have no op, which I can't. What that does is it prevents you from running the same job again and processing based on the job name. So you don't want to reprocess a job. That would not be good. And then I have a job name here that shows the job instance and version. And if I take a look at this Db2 data, this is the table that I'm using that I'm going to make the change to and then display onto the screen. Okay. All right, let's see what's happening. Okay, went over this. So you have a Spring app. This is the main processing of the Spring Batch. I have a main method here. I start the batch job, and it lets me know whether the job succeeded or not. A Spring configuration. This has, well, my job repository, the job launcher, and then the data source. Notice I didn't write a lot of code here. A lot of this, Spring uses these things called beans, and they use these annotations. So I'm using a Spring annotation, which already has all that code developed. You're just leveraging on top of it. So you have the configuration and enable batch processing. And that's the power of Spring. Some of the projects I'm on, we use Spring Boot for a lot of things, and it's surprising how much code we don't write. And just learning the APIs and how to use it, leverage and use the APIs. The batch configurations, not a whole lot of code here. I have a chunk size and a fetch size. I have a cursor. I'm using a JDBC cursor, ItemReader. I set the data source, row map, and the fetch size. And this is my SQL string here. And then this is the step processing that we're going through. Custom item processor. This is some of the things here that we use. This is where if I was going to write any business logic, most of your business logic would be written into your item processors. Notice I extend the item processor, which is part of Spring Batch. I'm implementing it. I'm not extending it, which means that can change the underlying structure. You're just doing implementation. You have to implement the process. So I implement the process method, and I process that method. I have a custom writer that I've written, and I write it out to JSON. And when I go ahead and run this thing right now, let's see. You notice I don't have anything in this fetch.json. And the reason I write it out in JSON is because the HTML front end is just completely separate, and I'm using jQuery, so it processes JSON. You notice it loads the JSON here, and it'll process it very efficiently. There's not a lot of code there either. So let me go ahead and run the Spring Batch, Spring application. Okay, let's look at the console output first. So you notice it had the chunk size of 3, so it processes 3 records, writes, processes 3 records, and writes, and so on, until it finishes. And then it completes. Its status is completed. And it was using this table here from the IBM employee table, and reprocessed that and JSONized it. So I'm going to go ahead and say yes. Now it's in the JSON format. The reason this is important is I can show you in a real quick example. I'm just using basic HTML with jQuery, create table from JSON. That's it. There's no server on the back end or anything. The bonus has changed. The salaries have increased. And that was one of the primary things that we did on this project was checking out the cursor. And it's because the DBA was concerned that if it couldn't handle cursors, then it would be a major issue of what we need to do. We did also check the retry and skip. That works as well. And I think that's about it. Does anyone want to go over the schema, or is there any questions so far? Question?
Open source, possible to use it?
Spring Batch is open source. You don't need to buy anything. You can go on to spring.io, do a search on Spring Batch, and you should be able to download it. That's what we did here. We didn't buy any software here. When we were running this in the office, the Db2 was on mainframe system. We had to establish a JDBC connection to the mainframe to test what we were doing. Mostly, we were concerned with cursor because that was one of the biggest issues that we were concerned about. And again, it's one of those things. When you have your application, do you want your batch processing on mainframe, or do you want it on Spring Batch as a possible solution? And I think it's up to your company and what you're trying to accomplish. If you may have some newer applications that are not as critical, I would take a look at Spring Batch and maybe migrate some of that to the Spring Batch on the client server environment, and then see how that works out for you. I've done some stuff with productions. Have you done anything with production support here? I've noticed I work mostly on the client server side, and we have a large application that does a lot of processing from mainframe, and we use an ETL process, and then we transform it and we put it into a Mongo database. And one of the problems I see quite a bit is bad data on the mainframe, because I'm getting all the messages when I do production support 6 a.m. I'm on the client server end. We have a mainframe team that does the batch processing, and I notice some of the things they run into, and one of them is bad data. We're getting different sources, and something has failed, so they kick out those records, and they have to go into them and then see how they can process those records later. Anything else?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
For example, we have two groups of people working
Okay.
with different applications. Could they use only Schema? Could they parallel work with one Schema?
So you have two. The question is, if we have two groups of people and they're working separately, and can they work parallel? I'm not quite sure what the question. Is it through the batch processing, or is it through?
Yeah, we have one set of tables.
Oh, okay.
Could it be used at the same time from different people?
I would have to see how we.
Different jobs.
Yeah, for different jobs. Oh, I see what you're saying. So you have different jobs running concurrently using the same tables. I don't see why it wouldn't. It's something we'd have to test to find out. I would test it, make sure that it works. But that's a good question. Question in the back? Oh, yes. The scheduling. There is possible to schedule jobs in Spring Batch. You can schedule it through Control-M as one of the things that you can use to schedule the batch jobs. Question?
So the database structure in the background is remodeled in the code as JPA, or?
I used OpenJPA to map it. Yes. And one of the issues when OpenJPA, if you're a developer, and maybe some of the DBAs notice, OpenJPA, it does map it, and you can run queries. But I find a lot of times when we go to validation, we have large data sets, it runs slowly. And then I have to talk to the DBA, and we do the explains, and it's not quite what we want, so we have to write native queries. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I've seen that maybe 30% of our queries have to be written native queries. OpenJP or any of those ORM products, they work, but they don't always give you the most efficiency that you may need. And again, it's one of those things I talk to the the DBAs and then decide, okay, do we need a new table? Do we need to write a native query? And that's kind of one of the things that we've run into. Same thing with this batch processing. I think it's more a partnership with the DBAs and the developers, especially with using new technology to verify that it does work and it works in your use case. And in our use case, we did run into a couple things because we're learning this as we're developing it in the Spring Batch. I just picked up a book. I talked to him. He was skeptical about it because he worked on previous projects using Spring Batch, using just Java Batch with no standards, and it was a lot of work to get it to run. And again, if you go, it was customized to one application. If you go to another application, you run into the same customization issues, and there's things they'd miss, skip, retry, start, all that, and they didn't have any really good front end. And when the Spring Batch came out, I think it solved a lot of those issues for the development team. And again, it's using, recap, it is using the IBM JSR 352. IBM had decades of experience with batch processing, and it just leveraged that, and it was able to implement it. And I think it's used quite a bit. It's used in a few places. I don't think it's caught on a whole lot. Our DBA did know someone in Chicago that did use it and explain a couple of the issues he ran into. And that's probably why he wanted us to look into cursor and make sure that that works. That was most important to him, that the cursor works. And then when you scale this thing out, we did some testing where we did scale it out. We had to use Linux servers and use, I think we used RabbitMQ to massively parallel process it using millions of records. Like, it's one thing for developers. One first thing is get it to work, right? Okay, we get it to work. Now, can it scale? And we got it to scale. And then the other problem was we had our environments fairly secure. They were using virus scan on everything coming across the wire, so it slowed things way down. But these are some of the things that you'd have to look into when you do any Spring Batch implementation. Any other questions? Question?
You said the reader also is working on a file, So it's possible to read a file. And the question is it also possible to write files with this framework?
Yes. Let me go back to my presentation. So the question was, is it using the ItemReader, is it possible to read the files and with the ItemWriter to write the files, correct? So let me go back to, let me see if I can find my slide real quick. So you have different files that you can read. Now, Spring provides a lot of implementations already out of the box. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. They support flat files, XML, JSON, JDBC connection. There's a boatload that they support. And you would do that in your ItemReader, read from a file. And then you process. The ItemWriter is where you write out, same thing, same support, but with different file systems. And in the demo, I read from Db2 file and wrote out to a JSON file. Now, this could write back to Db2 file. There's no limit on that. Does that answer your question? Yeah, that's pretty much. So this is the ItemReader and writer. You're not going to write a lot of. You're just going to implement the interface that they have provided for you. Spring has provided for you. Most of your logic is going to be in this item processor step. And I think what I like about Spring, anybody here use Spring or Spring Framework? A few. Yeah, what I like about Spring, it does take care of a lot of the infrastructure for you. You don't have to write a lot of that code that you would have to write in the past. Okay. Any other questions? Nope. Okay, that concludes my presentation. Please fill out the survey and let me know how I did. Thank you.